Old-Fashioned Murder and Mayhem. River Justice. Helen Ruth Spence Eaton, 1934. At first glance, the photograph appears to feature a petite beauty reposing on her left side. Her left arm curled gently upward, resting against her brow. Her right arm lies casually along her right hip, her knees bent up slightly in a semi-fetal position. She seems to be sleeping peacefully. Her dark hair is cropped short. The mind could be tricked into believing this is a photograph of a tender scene. Except as the whole picture comes into view, it is apparent that the young woman is lying in the dirt, and that a dark stain of liquid is pooled under her head like a gruesome, misshapen pillow. There is a pistol shoved into the belt of her breeches. She is not asleep. She is dead. At 22 years of age, Helen Ruth Spence had traveled a terrible and circuitous road to arrive here, shot to death on a dusty rural Arkansas road in 1934. The events leading up to her murder could have been, and almost were, lost to time, except for the promises made by an old friend and a former newspaper reporter to resurrect her story and clear her name. Welcome to the True Crime Podcast, Old-Fashioned Murder and Mayhem. I am your host, Mindy Hudson. This podcast brings you historical stories of murders and scandals that occurred in small towns throughout America. By combining the resources and methods used in genealogy research, I piece together the details of the lives and circumstances of notorious events that touched the lives of our ancestors. The aim of this podcast is to examine the background, documents, newspaper accounts, and cultural influences surrounding the events. It is not my purpose to sensationalize or shame the subjects or their families. All families have skeletons in the closet. But to look at the lives of real people and see how circumstances of nature and nurture, as well as how world events affected the lives of the people involved in the stories. I have spent over 50 years interested in genealogy research and recently retired as head of genealogy at the Jefferson County Library in Missouri. During my tenure, I began a podcast entitled Murder and Mayhem in Jefferson County, Missouri, which gained popularity. Upon my retirement, I decided to continue and expand the podcast with similar stories found in small towns across the United States. Join me now as we explore tales of old-fashioned murder and mayhem. For those who grow up near streams, rivers, lakes, and oceans, the water calls to us. It is like a lifeblood that draws us home. The rushing tinkle of the water rolling over rocks or crashing into shore is a lullaby we long to hear all our days. Helen Ruth Spence, born on the lower White River in Arkansas on February 23, 1912, was the second child of Wilburn Cicero Spence and Ellen Woods. They made their home on a shanty houseboat along the shores of the White River in Arkansas County, Arkansas. In the early part of the 20th century, the residents who lived on the river eked out a living by fishing, logging, and hunting for freshwater pearls along the banks of the river. In those days, the mussel shells that were found could yield pearls that were sought by pearl buyers worldwide and could bring $100 apiece. The shells were used to make pearlescent buttons in the factories nearby. The close-knit communities that sprang up among the river people were known to be especially protective of their kind, but also meted out their own justice for any infraction of their unspoken rules and traditions. They viewed outsiders, drylanders, and the government with suspicion and contempt, and were met with the same disdain by those outside their clan. Helen's mother died sometime around 1915, leaving her husband with two small daughters to raise. The following year, Cicero married Jane Elam, with whom he had another daughter, Eva. According to the 1920 federal census, Cicero was living in Monroe County, Arkansas, near Clarendon, with his second wife, 3 daughters, his brother, Pless Spence, and sister-in-law, Julia. He and Pless worked as timber cutters. The union between Cicero and Jane was short-lived. In 1921, she had a son named Wesley, whose father could have been Cicero or her second husband. By 1930, she was married to a man named Jonah Aiken and had moved to McDonald County, Missouri, with the youngest 2 children and her parents. The 1930 federal census listed Eva as Aiken's stepdaughter and Wesley as his son. Another woman, said to be Cicero's third wife, had moved into the houseboat. There is some confusion about her name. It may have been Clora or Ada. Very little is known about her background, and no marriage record for the union has been found. For this narrative, she is referred to as Ada. Helen's older sister, Edna, called Edie, was crippled and mostly homebound. She was later described as having the same beautiful features as her sister. Helen was a spunky and beautiful girl. Living on the river, she spent her days splashing in the cool, muddy water along its banks, digging for worms, fishing for catfish and perch, and gathering mussels whose empty shells could be converted into tiny dishes to hold small river pebbles and sand. Having lost her mother so early, Helen was particularly close to her daddy. She shadowed him as he fished and hunted the lower White River. There were plenty of children raised along the banks of the river to befriend, and although river people and drylanders tended to avoid one another, Helen's outgoing personality won the hearts of both cultures. She was well liked and respected among the people who knew her in Clarendon, DeWitt, St. Charles, and the other small communities along the river. One little boy was especially enamored with Helen. L.C. Brown, Jr., called Jr., was a drylander. His father, Lemuel Brown, Sr., was the deputy sheriff of St. Charles, Arkansas. His uncle lived on the river, and Lem spent a lot of time among the river folk, earning a degree of trust. Jr. was about 6 years old, and often accompanied his father to the river. That is where he met Helen, who was a teenager. She treated him so kindly that it always brightened his day when he was able to spend time with her. Years later, he would play a vital role in her story. Petite, with dark hair and eyes, Helen was a talented seamstress who sewed her own fashionable clothes. On January 21st, 1930, at 17, she married Marion Sylvester Buster Eaton, a commercial fisherman. Buster was born in Poplar Bluff, Missouri, and was almost 30. He and Helen had likely known each other for more than a decade. His World War I draft card indicated he worked for the Spence brothers as a timber cutter in 1918. Rugged and handsome, average in build, with blue eyes and brown hair, Buster still towered over Helen in the photograph that appears to have been taken on their wedding day. The dress she wore was white, with a floral design, and probably handmade by Helen. Ruffles and tucks gave the garment a distinctly feminine flair. A dark cloche hat was perched fashionably on her head. Buster was dressed nicely in slacks and a striped shirt with a tie. His fisherman hat perched on his head, and a cigarette held between his lips gave him an air of a weathered working man standing next to his fresh-faced bride. It was his second marriage. A 1924 marriage to Blanche Williams had ended in divorce. There is some question about why Buster and Helen wed so suddenly. It may have been because of a dangerous situation going on in and around the Spence houseboat. The Eaton wedding took place in January 1930, and Helen reported her age as 18. However, she was still underage until February 23rd and didn't have any parental consent on the form. The marriage was illegal. If she was ever given the opportunity to remedy that, she chose not to do it, and the couple parted ways. Helen returned to the houseboat and into the chaos that would forever change the course of her life. Depression-era river justice was a harsh and terrible thing. A man could be shot to death and his body dumped into the churning waters over cheating in a card game or saying something inappropriate to a man's wife. In early 1927, Cicero and Ada Spence were accused of the murder of a man named Jed Wisley. Cicero Spence was convicted of the crime and sentenced to 9 years. While he was out on bond awaiting sentencing from the Supreme Court, the river dwellers exacted their own brand of justice. The details of the event vary, but the following account was published in the Arkansas newspaper, the Hope Star. 2 men, Jack Worrells and Jess Nixon, were sent to deliver a more severe form of punishment. Somehow, in April 1930, the 2 men lured Cicero and Ada Spence out on the river in a motorboat. The men got into an argument, and Worrells shot Cicero several times, then pushed him into the water to drown. They took Ada, terrified and shrieking, somewhere along the riverbanks where they brutally beat and raped her through the night, then brought her back to a point near the houseboat and dumped her into the river. Remarkably, she managed to get help and was taken to the hospital in Memphis, Tennessee, where she was able to tell authorities that Cicero, who was unarmed, had been shot by Worrells following an argument. She related how they continued to travel downriver in the motorboat until they reached a point near Cow Pen Bend, where they pushed the fatally injured man into the water to drown. Frantic over the fate of her father, Helen had to immediately take charge of her sister while the hunt to recover his body began. The Spence daughters were left reeling in shock and grief as the search continued for the body of Cicero. A death certificate was issued on April 19th, stating he had died of drowning. It took 2 months before the body was discovered, and a second certificate was issued listing the coroner's conclusion that the cause of death was a homicide from gunshot wounds. When Worrells and Nixon were arrested, Worrells, 22, admitted he shot Spence, but claimed it was in self-defense. This argument seemed ludicrous since Ada Spence had been battered. The stress and agony Helen experienced over the loss of her daddy left her so despondent that she tried to commit suicide. Following the discovery of her father's body, Helen took a job as a waitress in a local restaurant. A short time later, she had lost her job. Her stepmother was still in serious condition at the Memphis hospital. It was all too much for the teenage girl. She entered the Powell restaurant muttering that she didn't want to live, walked up to the cigar counter and shot herself in the chest. Rushed to the same Memphis facility as her stepmother, Helen survived. However, Ada died from the injuries she'd received at the hands of Worrells and Nixon. In January 1931, the trial for Jack Worrells was set to begin. At that point, Helen had resolved to see the man responsible for the murder of her father answer for his crime. Knowing that the Drylanders would not put any value on the life of her father, river people were called river rats by the locals, Helen was determined to attend the trial, which was held in DeWitt, Arkansas. As the arguments drew to a close, the fear that the jury would let Worrells go free haunted her. Monday, January 19th, was the day the jury deliberations were to begin. That morning, Helen chose her most vibrant and fashionable dress. It was a deep red velvet dress trimmed with white fur. She set a coordinating hat on her head. She made her way down the dusty street to the courthouse. A large crowd of spectators had packed into the courtroom and spilled out into the street. The locals were there, eager to be entertained by the excitement of a murder trial, while their children played in the streets. Helen entered the courtroom and sat down right behind Jack Worrells. Beside him was his defense lawyer and Sheriff Lem C. Brown, Sr., who was guarding the prisoner. As the jury began to file out of the courtroom, Helen slowly rose to her feet. She reached her hand into the cuff of her sleeve and drew out a small pearl-handled pistol and fired 4 times into the body of Jack Wuerls. He fell to the floor dead. The courtroom erupted in panic. People were screaming, shouting, and diving to the floor. Some were rushing toward the exit. Sheriff Brown and a few other men sprinted toward Helen and wrested the gun from her as she calmly waited. Her eyes were fixed on Wuerls, who was sprawled on the floor in a pool of blood. She showed no emotion as she was led to a table and pushed down into a chair. Several court authorities gathered around her as Sheriff Brown, his hands shaking violently, tried to open the gun to empty the rest of the bullets. Unable to get the barrel to open, he struggled with it. Helen casually reached across the table and pulled the gun from his hands as the men panicked. Some dove away, some leaped toward her, but she continued to quietly open the barrel. Her eyes fixed on Sheriff Brown, she said, "It sticks," as she handed the weapon back to him, the remaining bullets spilling out of the chamber. Those who had come to DeWitt that day to ease the boredom of daily life had been rewarded with a spectacle that would propel the tiny Arkansas town into the national spotlight. When questioned why she had done it, she explained, "He killed my daddy. I'm not sorry for it, and I'd do it again." The Barry Daily Times reported the 18-year-old girl's statement, quote, "I was afraid the jury was going to free him. Wuerls claimed he killed my father in self-defense, but I shot him down like he did my father, in the back, or at least from behind." End quote. To another reporter, Helen stated, "Down where I was raised in the White River Bottoms, we take care of such matters ourselves." End of article. Helen was taken to the Arkansas State Penitentiary to be held for trial. Word of the excitement found its way into newspapers nationwide. Her trial was slated to start on March 30th, 1931. The Fort Worth Star-Telegram reported Helen as saying she was anxious to get it over with. Due to Cicero's previous trial and that of Wuerls, she was intimately acquainted with the DeWitt County Courthouse. Quote, "It seems I've been there for every term of court for 2 or 3 years," she said. Helen's defense lawyer knew his work was cut out for him. There had been multiple witnesses to the shooting. He would need to convince the jury she was driven to insanity by the brutal murder of her father at the hands of Jack Wuerls. Newspapers reported, family and friends testified that after her father's death, Helen had not been herself. Dr. L.R. Brown of the state hospital testified that he believed her to be insane after observing her and learning of her family background. When the jury was sent to deliberate, they struggled with what to do about her. Some wanted to convict her, some to set her free, and others wanted her punished to a much lesser degree. They sent word to the judge asking if they could reduce the charges to manslaughter. He said they could only find her guilty of murder in the 1st or 2nd degree, or not guilty. They ended up compromising with the verdict of guilty of murder in the 2nd degree and sentenced her to 5 years in prison. The Hope Star reported on April 3, 1931, quote, "She smiled faintly when the verdict was announced and resumed the impassive, restrained expression that remained on her face during the long, tedious trial. She was released under a $1,000 bond pending the disposition of an appeal." Leaving immediately with the sheriff, she walked down the street with her head held high. End of article. Eventually, Helen was able to find lodging in DeWitt and took a job as a waitress at the White House lunchroom, owned by a Greek man by the name of Jim Bohatz. There is very little known about Bohatz except that he was rumored to have a shady reputation. His unwanted advances toward Helen finally were too much, and despite how desperately she needed the job, she quit. In February 1932, Bohatz was discovered slumped in the driver's seat of his car with 2 slugs in his chest. A gun was found beneath the car. The coroner remarked that it could not have been suicide, and he believed a woman was implicated. That led to the questioning of Helen Spence, as she was known to have rejected his attention. 2 notes were found on Bohat, which were requests for money, one for $6 and the other for $10. On the back was an endorsement with Helen Spence's name. She insisted that she was not with him on the night of his murder and had no knowledge of the murder. She also claimed that she had been at a local cafe with a friend named Ruth Gordon that night. With no more evidence than that, she was not arrested. While this played out, Helen's conviction for the murder of Worrells was reversed on technicalities, and a new trial was granted. Later that year, she pleaded guilty to manslaughter and received a sentence of 2 years, with 9 months subtracted from time already served. She was sent to the state prison farm in Jacksonville, Arkansas. The prison farm already had a notorious reputation. In 1926, a 23-year-old woman named Winona Green attempted to escape what was to be a life sentence for the brutal murder of her in-laws. This was her second effort to flee her penalty. The previous year, she sawed through 3 metal bars at the Pulaski County Jail with a file and dropped 20 feet to freedom. She was captured a short time later and sent to the women's farm. The following year, she and 2 other women fashioned a makeshift key and fled the farm. When recaptured, Winona defiantly declared, quote, "You can tell the public that I kept my promise to escape and that I'll be gone again soon. I'll go back, take my 25 lashes and 2 months' confinement on bread and water with a smile, but I'll not stay. They may shoot me in the back, but I'd much prefer such a death to starvation. None of us girls at the farm ever get enough to eat." End quote. The story of Winona Green will be covered in full in another episode. There were rumors that the young women held at the farm were periodically taken to Memphis, where they were trafficked for sex. In the spring of 1933, Helen Spence was able to slip away from the guard at the bus station in West Memphis. Unfortunately, she was quickly recaptured. Before her return to the farm, Helen had a long talk with Major J.A. Pitcock, head of the Little Rock Detective Bureau. He was also the detective who had gained the confession of the double homicide from Winona Green nearly a decade before. Whatever was discussed in the interview, Helen came away trusting the detective and considered him a friend. When she was paroled in June 1933, her $4,000 bond was paid by a businessman from Scott County, Arkansas, named W.B. Graham. Upon her release, she was sent to work on his plantation. The story of Helen should have ended here. However, for reasons that cannot be fathomed, she returned 3 days later to Major Pitcock and stated she wanted to confess to the murder of Jim Bohatz. There is speculation that she had been sold into a sex trafficking ring run by Graham. It is possible that she thought by claiming to be responsible for the Bohat murder, she'd escape that fate. The era of the Roaring Twenties and Depression 30s in the United States had seen a dramatic rise in sensational crimes. This was the time before the news was delivered via radio and television. The humdrum life of small-town America was only interrupted by headlines screaming stories of murder, robbery, mobsters, and scandal. Prohibition and poverty mingled together to make folk heroes out of mobsters and malls, car chases, gunfights, and shocking behavior. Upon Helen's confession of Bohat's murder, she was instantly catapulted into the limelight of notorious women such as Bonnie Parker, Billie Frechette, Ma Barker, and the like. She was less than 20 years old and had already murdered 2 men. Charged with murder, she pleaded guilty and returned to the women's farm in July 1933. Her notoriety did not please the prison warden, V.O. Brockman, and his wife Nellie, who served as superintendent to the female prisoners, and it didn't take long before Helen regretted her decision. Was Graham in league with the Brockmans? We'll probably never know, but it is clear that Helen soon realized she'd basically jumped out of the frying pan and into the fire. In September, she attempted to escape, but was tracked by bloodhounds as she cowered in the fields. Less than a week later, she was reported missing again. This time, she managed to hide in the sweltering attic above the mess hall for 24 hours without food or water. She had planned to escape under the cover of darkness, but was found by Mrs. Brockman before her plan could be carried out. In November, she got another chance when she and a fellow inmate were able to drive out in an employee's car while Mrs. Brockman, thinking they were the imprisoned employees, watched. The car was discovered abandoned about 15 miles away, and the women were tracked to a rural store in Faulkner County, Arkansas. They were returned to the prison the following day. Each escape brought Helen severe punishment. Records indicated for every infraction she was whipped with a lash nicknamed Black Snake and held in a cage with only bread and water. Nevertheless, whatever was going on in the Arkansas Penal System was bad enough that the hope for freedom was more desired than fear of punishment. In the following months, Helen bided time by writing detective stories that she attempted to have published. The stories were returned with rejections, but the discovery she was submitting stories may have alarmed the prison staff. What if she wrote about what was going on at the prison farm? She was sent briefly to the Hospital for Nervous Disorders, perhaps as a warning. Wednesday, July 11th, 1934, Helen was back at the prison working in the strawberry patch when she complained of feeling ill. She asked and was granted permission to return to the prison infirmary to get some medication. Newspaper accounts of what happened next claimed that Helen slipped around the front of the building instead of going to the infirmary. Having changed into men's clothing, she entered the room of prisoner Frank Martin, a trustee, and stole his pistol. She managed to escape undetected. Newspapers reported that a note was found in her locker which read, quote, "To whom it may concern, I'll never be taken alive," end quote. The release of the note seemed odd. The newspapers painted her as a desperate murderess who was armed and dangerous. There was speculation that she was headed back to the White River, which was likely her destination. The river was calling her home. Despite the inclusion of bloodhounds in the search, Helen managed to evade capture until the following day. She entered a local farmhouse and asked Mrs. H.R. Van, the farmer's wife, to give her a ride away from the area. It was reported that Helen came into the house brandishing a gun. Later accounts dismiss this claim, and it doesn't fit with Helen's action up to this point. The farmer's wife claimed she could not drive, then called for her husband. He alerted the prison, and Helen fled into the brush. If she had had a weapon, it seems unlikely she'd allow the Vans to report her whereabouts. Upon arriving at the area, V.O. Brockman and the trustee, 33-year-old Frank Martin, spotted Helen walking down Tadpole Road. They split up to catch her as she fled in either direction. Martin claimed that he saw her first and shouted for her to stop. When she darted toward the brush, he said that she reached for the gun, which was in the waistband of her pants. He had a shotgun and fired a bullet that struck behind her right ear. Helen fell on the dusty road, dead. She was 22. The photograph of Helen's dead body on the dirt road seems staged. In one photograph, the gun is shoved into her belt. In another, it is shoved into her bra. In a third, both hands cover her face. Something about the entire scene doesn't add up. Had it not been that the one who fired the fatal shot was a prison trustee, the story of Helen Spence would have surely been lost. When word got out that an armed prisoner, a convicted murderer, had been given a shotgun and allowed to kill another prisoner, there was a firestorm of outrage. The following day, as crowds lined the streets to get a look at the body of the beautiful yet notorious murdered girl, displayed in the mortuary window, the Arkansas Federation of Women's Clubs and even newspaper reporters were demanding an investigation of the Arkansas Penal System. A July 12th editorial by Alex H. Washburn in the Hope Star cited that, quote, "Obviously, our system of volunteer guards taken from the ranks of the prisoners is unfair to justice, the prisoners, and the convicts. A trustee guard could hardly shoot in plain self-defense without bringing down criticism on the state, suspicion on its state prison, and a murder charge against the guard," end quote. Pennsylvania's Reading Times noted that at the time of the shooting, quote, 12 salaried employees of the state operate the system. More than 1,500 convicts are used in the cultivation of the 17,000 acres which make up the farms. End quote. The article goes on to describe the present system of choosing trustees. Those with long sentences tended to be chosen because they made for better trustees, according to prison officials. There were various levels of prisoners. The more hardened and the less trustworthy prisoners were used in the fields. A line of guards carrying shotguns would parallel the workers, and mounted riders with guns were stationed at each end. If a prisoner attempted to escape, the guards would shoot first and ask questions later. If a trustee failed to show an effort to prevent escape, he'd be put back on labor duty. It was a system just waiting to fail, and a rash of prisoner deaths at the hands of trustees already had citizens up in arms. Now a convicted murderer had shot and killed a young woman in the back of the head. By Friday, July 13th, Arkansas Governor J.M. Futrell was faced with a boiling pot of scandal and outrage. He wanted the state penal board and the courts to handle the situation. With pressure mounting, A.G. Stedman, superintendent of the Arkansas prison system, submitted his resignation. During his 18-month tenure as superintendent, there were 14 convict deaths at the hands of trustees. Former warden S.L. Todhunter replaced Stedman. Todhunter immediately ordered that all trustee guards and shotguns be removed from the Jacksonville farm. Mrs. Nellie Brockman was removed as superintendent of the women's prison, and her husband, V.O. Brockman, was removed as assistant superintendent. The Brockmans were suspected of aiding Helen's escape or setting her up. They were replaced with Mr. and Mrs. Ben Maddox of Tucker Prison. In the meantime, attempts to contact what was left of Helen's family to claim her body had failed. Concerned citizens donated a dress so that the unfortunate young woman could be buried in something more becoming than the men's clothing she'd been wearing. The undertaker at the mortuary said that if no family came to claim her, Helen would be buried in a small cemetery at the edge of town. It was unknown at that time that Helen's sister, Edna Spence Ferguson, and her husband, J.W. Ferguson, had been en route to Arkansas at the time of her murder. The couple had left their home in Oklahoma and headed to St. Charles, Arkansas, to live with Edna's Uncle Ples Spence. They were unaware of Helen's death until days later. Helen's former neighbors on the river were frantic that her funeral was turning into a tourist spectacle and that she was to be buried so far away from her home. So late at night, a few of them slipped into the mortuary and stole her body. They secretly buried her in an unmarked grave in St. Charles, Arkansas. A man named John Black planted a cedar tree at the head of her grave to mark the spot, but nobody revealed where she was laid to rest for decades. When Edna arrived in Arkansas, she saw the newspaper articles claiming that Helen had left behind a note declaring how she wouldn't be captured alive. The note was published in the paper, and immediately Edna knew something was fishy about the story. She produced a large stack of handwritten letters from her sister to prove the handwriting on the escape note did not match that of Helen. In the end, it made no difference. Frank Martin was tried and found not guilty of the murder of Helen Spence. The story of the pretty little girl of the White River people could be considered tragic, except for the fact that her death was the catalyst that upended the corrupt prison system of Arkansas. Although the initial result of the light that had been shown on the Arkansas Penal System was a shakeup of the power structure, the replacements for all of those who resigned or were fired were drawn from the already tainted pool. In 1935, Superintendent Todd Hunter was fired following an investigation by the state comptroller Griffin Smith into the mishandling of funds. The scandal-ridden prison system surely was a factor in Governor Futrell's loss to Carl E. Bailey in the 1936 gubernatorial election. Bailey had run on a promise of prison reform. He stated, quote, "Our prison system is a social cancer and a relic of barbarism," end quote. Ultimately, in the end, it was a little girl born on a simple houseboat who brought river justice to Arkansas. Years later, just before his death, John Black revealed where she was buried to L.C. Brown, Jr., the boy whom Helen had once befriended. He asked Elsie to clear her name and honor her memory. As so often happens, a chance occurrence provided him the opportunity to keep that promise. In seeking information about her family roots on the White River, Denise Parkinson, a former newspaper reporter and editor, contacted Mr. Brown to hear his memories of life by the river. He told her the story of Helen Spence. Miss Parkinson realized the story of Helen was also the story of the river people. She set to work writing, and her book, Daughter of the White River, Depression-Era Treachery and Vengeance in the Arkansas Delta, was the result of years of research. I highly recommend getting a copy. Also, a project by River Daughter Enterprises, LLC, entitled Daughter of the White River, based on the book, was completed and premiered at the movie theater in Stuttgart, Arkansas in December 2022. A special online premiere will be airing on the 111th birthday of Helen Spence, February 23, 2023. Information about the premiere, a link to information about the book and author, and sources used in this presentation will be found on the Old Fashioned Murder and Mayhem Facebook site or in the description box on the YouTube presentation of this podcast. Special thanks must be given to Denise Parkinson for her help in providing details and photographs for this podcast. Her passion for the history of the Arkansas River people is apparent in the care and unwavering determination with which she seeks to preserve the heritage of this unique culture. For more information on this and other podcasts of Old Fashioned Murder and Mayhem, please follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram, where there are links to resources, photographs, and documents used to construct the stories. For questions, comments, or suggestions for other historical subjects, please email Mindy Hudson at MELINDAMALOO@gmail.com. Join us again next month for another episode of Old Fashioned Murder and Mayhem.